Hello, and thank you for joining us for Diagnostic Dilemma, hosted by Assessment HQ, a project of the Collaborative for Student Success. Before we get going with our program, I wanted to provide a few housekeeping options for folks as they join. As you join this event, you will notice that you will be on mute and off video in order to have full screen with our panelists and discussants. So just a couple notes on WebEx as a platform, if for those that aren't as familiar with it. In your upper right-hand screen, you will be able to see a variety of views, so you can change how the panelists appear as we go. And then in the bottom right-hand screen, you will see that there are two different ways to communicate with us. One, if you have any technical issues whatsoever, please use the chat function, which is circled here in yellow. If you'd like to ask a question at any time throughout the event, please click on the ellipse button that is highlighted here in blue, and that will pick up the Q&A function. And we have a dedicated amount of time at the end of this program for questions. We have a 45-minute program, and so without further delay, I'm going to hand it over to our moderator, Dale Chu.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you to everyone who is tuning in this morning or this afternoon, depending where you are. We are delighted to have all of you here today. This is the second in a series that Assessment HQ has been doing under the auspices of the Collaborative for Student Success in terms of delving into the state of play with assessments. So if you joined us last week, we started off very high level in terms of sort of the how and the why when it comes to measurement, given today's extraordinary and unique circumstances. And today, we've got three really outstanding folks that are going to help us try to surface and I don't know if we can do it in 45 minutes, but overcome perhaps, or get at overcoming some of the implementation challenges when it comes to diagnostic assessments. So we have Dr. Eric Becoats, who is the District Superintendent, William Penn School District outside of Philadelphia, though Eric has sort of sat in the hot seat a number of times through his career. We also have Laura Jimenez, who is the Director of Standards and Accountability for the Center for American Progress. We're delighted to have Laura. She's also worn many hats sort of before getting to where she is now, including a stint at the United States Department of Education. And then we have Juan from the Center for Assessment. He is sort of our, I guess, a subject matter expert here. He's also has tons and tons of experience, including working at the state level in West Virginia, and he helps to provide technical assistance now on all matters assessment, I think, across the country. So a quick refresher, and I want to dive into questions for our panelists here. Back in April, the Collaborative did a survey of 5,400 teachers and other stakeholders across the country. And one of the interesting findings from that survey was that there was broad support for some sort of diagnostic assessment, right? 60% of teachers said they supported something like this. Even higher numbers when it came to administrators, 70% said some sort of diagnostic made sense. But like almost everything in education policy, some dissent or some questions have started developing around this particular topic. A small issue is around semantics. The word diagnostic connotes and denotes certain things or certain people, depending who you talk with. But a much bigger issue, I think, is some of the tensions underlying this question of diagnostic assessments. There's a smaller issue with regard to the actual administration of some sort of test coming up this school year. But then the bigger concern, I think, lies under sort of how these assessments are going to be used. And that's something that I'm eager to dive into with Eric, Juan, and Laura in a moment. But some of these tensions, very high level, there's some equity concerns here, right, that sort of in the wrong hands or not used correctly. Any sort of assessment data that comes out could be used as fodder or ammunition to over-remediate or retain students unnecessarily, further exacerbating some of the challenges we're anticipating, especially for our most marginalized communities in this country. There's also instructional questions, right, that whatever assessment is used, the quality might not be as good as maybe what teachers sort of know and have learned about their students. There's also the question of eduhawks that vendors are eager to sell and school districts are eager to buy, I think. There's all this swirling around while the feds have largely decided to sit this one out. So let's get into some questions here. So there's been a lot of dire warnings and predictions about what learning loss might look like, come this fall. So how should schools go about getting a handle on this? And I want to start with Eric because Eric is on the ground leading a school district, but then I would like Juan and Laura to chime in. So Eric, what's your thought here?
Well, my thought is that I believe that diagnostics are important, but I also think it's more important to understand what you're going to do with the information once you get it back. So I think a diagnostic does help a teacher to understand what I need to be doing in the classroom to better move my students toward proficiency, if you will. And so I think we also have to take a step back and understand, are we providing a diagnostic in every content area? Is it certain content areas we provide the diagnostic in? And how do we utilize that information to better support our students? And ideally, it's a piece of information for teachers to use. So for example, one of the requirements that I would want all teachers to implement is that we have small group instruction, because we know that research supports that small group instruction helps to move students. So the diagnostic would give a teacher information as relates to how to group or potentially regroup students based upon what that data provides. So one, I do believe that diagnostics are important. And two, I think that we have to have a clear path as it relates to how we will utilize the information to better improve outcomes for those particular students.
Laura, Juan, you have want to add to that?
Sure. I think we're in a moment right now where we are seeing the glaring inequities that our education system has been plagued with for decades. They are really coming to a surface, and I think we have an opportunity to address them. So if we go back to the status quo of focusing very narrowly on just student academics and not what helps student access the academics and get to mastery, then we're kind of missing a really unique opportunity that I don't know will come along again. So I do think that districts and schools really need to be diagnosing per se across multiple areas. So one is, what is student attendance looking like and how are students participating? Then looking at what are those academics, issuing a screener that measures the distance between where students are in the moment and where they need to be to reach grade level academic mastery. Then I think districts and schools should be looking at what are the conditions for learning for students, including their physical and emotional well-being and access to education resources like any digital learning platforms that schools might be using. And then assessing what family engagement looks like, because parents and families are going to play an even more critical role in supporting their children's learning, especially if schools remain remote to any degree this coming year.
Go ahead, Juan.
Thank you. I want to kind of reiterate what both Laura and Eric were discussing. I think that one of the key things is we need to address some of the existing problems that we're seeing amplified. And I think that there's an absolute value, and I'll say this, I think, very carefully. The use of diagnostic assessments can be a powerful tool if and only if they're diagnosing what you're intending for them to diagnose. Mm-hmm. And so much like we have seen problems over the course of the last couple of decades with the proliferation of interim assessments, diagnostic assessments, anything like that, thinking about assessment as part of the process and part of a larger system, and understanding the role and limitations of assessment used in the aggregate, especially when you're talking about larger grain size information that many people are thinking that might be key ways to establish some traction to identify gaps at the beginning of the year. Those may not be the area of focus. And I think Laura alluded to this and I think spoke to it directly, which is the idea of we really need to probably engage more of our diagnosis initially around the contextual understanding of conditions and environment and student well-being, which will then enable us to more effectively diagnose student opportunities of loss of learning. And I think rather than thinking about it as learning loss, it's really a loss of opportunity to learn the content. from the prior year and over the summer, but being really clear about exactly what the intent of the information is, how you want to diagnose, what grain size you want to diagnose, can help you begin to evaluate whether certain assessments or formal tools are actually going to meet those needs. And it actually might be more effective to rely on some of the more finer grained curriculum embedded assessments that often come with a lot of the curriculum selection opportunities that come at the local level, the school level, or as part of the ongoing curricular design. Organizing those in a more coherent way will get us to a point where we can actually leverage some of the aggregate diagnosis or formalized assessment tools that can be aggregated up more effectively to kind of gauge progress over time. So I think it's about timing and sequence, which I think we'll get into a little bit later.
So let me try to draw a line through sort of what I've heard everyone sort of say here. So Eric talked about sort of some of the good stuff around diagnostics in terms of maybe it can help sort of determine sort of strategically how you group students. That I could definitely see that as being something helpful. Laura surfaced, among other things, sort of that it shouldn't necessarily just focus on academics. There's going to be a lot of other needs, so we could definitely envision a scenario where sort of without the right guidance, schools might focus solely on academics and not some of these other issues that, you know, are sort of unique to the situation now. And Juan, you talked about sort of grain size and being cognizant of what diagnostics can do and what they can't do. Though I think it's very easy to just say we want to sort of do all things, right? So can we talk a little bit, I want to tug on this thread a little bit more, like in terms of the good, bad, and ugly of diagnostic assessments. I mean, what do you see are other considerations that folks should be aware of? Any of you guys?
Well, I think one of the things that we have to be considerate of is the amount of time that it takes. And I definitely agree with Laura in that, you know, right now we have a pandemic committee on school reopening. And one of the things that we're talking about is what do we do during those first 2 weeks? So before we even get to instruction, there are some things that we're planning to put into place to address the social and emotional learning aspects of students. And there is a diagnostic, if you will, that will help you to gauge where students are. So again, I think we're taking a step back and saying, let's take some time to determine where students are, give students the opportunity to talk, give students the opportunity to express some of their thoughts and feelings. Maybe you're doing that through writing or through other ways, but we think that we have to do that before we even get to the instructional piece. But I think the biggest challenge is always time. And then secondly, what do you do with the information once you get it back from the diagnostic?
Yeah, I
Dale,
can.
I'd like to piggyback. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Laura. Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And I think that the order of operations is absolutely critical. And you can think about it almost like a way of thinking about like educational hierarchy of needs, right? You're not going to get access to getting students to engage in the content if you're not initially diagnosing or figuring out exactly what their needs are around their level of safety in their environment and what happened and what they're coming back from 3 months of being at home during a standard school year, on top of then their summer, and then coming back into thinking about maybe what a high level series of timing steps might look like, where first couple of weeks is about making sure that students' basic needs are met. And then the next few weeks is maybe about understanding some of the finer grain issues and allowing, making sure that there's opportunities for teachers to engage in collaborative planning, where I know there's been some talk about looping teachers and having teachers move with the kids for the next year, but I don't know if that's a very viable option, but having vertical teaching teams interact so that there can be some support with thinking about how to scaffold missing content knowledge to allow teachers to focus on the existing grade level as quickly as possible, which would then allow you to get to a point maybe a few weeks later to actually do some kind of potential more wide scale assessment to then get a sense of how schools in general are progressing. But kind of thinking about that timing in a very organized fashion in the same way that Eric's talking about with these reopening committees is absolutely critical.
Yeah, I can weigh in here. I think if, you know, as I'm hearing everyone speak and it's mirroring my own thoughts on this, is that this is really an opportunity to take a step back and to go slow right now, to go fast later. And I think if we are to take this as an opportunity to provide students a high quality education, we have to think differently about how we assess student needs. And I firmly believe that education leaders from the federal, state to the local level need to come together to think through what a coherent system of assessments is and looks like. Because I think in education, there are lots and lots of different assessments to the point where it takes so much time that it's become a bad word. When frankly, good assessments are very useful to teaching and learning, and that is the role that they should really be playing. So diagnostics really have to be part of that system. And in order to do that, they've got to be aligned with standards and curriculum, if we're talking about just the academic assessments. And in that way, they can be part of that coherent system of teaching and learning, so that they can work as a whole. You know, when teachers have a mashup of tests that serve no clear purpose, then I think you get some of the backlash that we've seen thus far. So being thoughtful right now and purposeful about what we're assessing, why we're assessing it, and how that information is going to be useful in the moment is really where we need to go.
So that's really, so you guys are just, among the three of you, put a lot on the table. There's a lot of considerations. I mean, one of the big things I just heard is when it comes to diagnostics, it doesn't happen in isolation. You have to have these other things, teachers collaborating with one another. You have to make the time, like Eric's talking about. You have to, you know, think about, you know, putting together a committee. There's a lot of moving parts. It's not just use this assessment and then there you go. But all that said, let's get a little bit more down to brass tacks in terms of implementation, right? Like, how is this actually going to look like in schools and districts across the country come, you know, with the coming school year? Like, how much work is this really going to involve? I mean, I hear all of you saying, you know, sort of, I think Laura, you had said sort of slow down to go fast, but I mean, give us more of a sense of like how much actual lift is required here.
Sure. So I think there are the existing off-the-shelf assessments that districts have been administering for years. So the time to administer those probably wouldn't take too much. However, the quality of data that they're going to provide is probably not going to be as useful in the moment as something that's a bit more customized. So I do think that assessments that are a bit more qualitative in nature, at least in the beginning, are probably going to be the most useful when we're talking about assessing things like attendance and engagement and physical and emotional well-being. Those could take the form of surveys, they could take the form of interviews with parents, interviews with students. And even though they will take a lot more time and effort to administer, I do think that they will yield, if they're well designed, information that's ultimately going to be most useful. And with that in mind, I do think that if district administrators and educators at the school level can think about what is the information that I need to be actionable within the next week, within the next 2 weeks, that data is probably going to be the most useful in the moment.
And I think to add to that, one of the things that I've been hearing a lot of states and districts talk about is the need to kind of, and I think to borrow Laura's point about the existing off-the-shelf assessments, they're often claimed to be associated with their standards aligned. And so therefore they must work. And if I'm going to go, again, push back to Dale, something that you started early on, the semantics and like being the word police around the idea of diagnostic or diagnosis is probably less valuable than thinking about the use. And so one of the things that I think is going to be really important to underline or underscore is the idea that much like instructing against standards isn't as useful as instructing against well-defined and coherent curriculum that's aligned to standards. Using assessments that are closer to the ground level, that are finer grained, that are likely more along the lines of teaching, reteaching strategies, that are less formalized assessments, are probably going to pay more dividends than an actual formalized assessment process, or I'm sorry, a formalized assessment instrument early on. And I think there's going to be a need to think about, I guess, to directly to your point about time. Districts now, I believe, have spent a great deal of time thinking about what their local assessment strategies look like in alignment with curriculum. And if you think about the role and purpose of an interim assessment or more formalized assessment tool, really it should be to corroborate what you've seen on the ground in the classroom at the school. And what you're hoping is to see some alignment there. And the idea of kind of grade standard sampling is way too coarse, it's way too blunt to inform whether people are walking down the right path. And so I think, again, it goes back to identifying initial actual student needs and then going to the actual curriculum aligned assessments that are available. And if not available, likely will have to be developed through some initial planning, because there's probably a host of assessment strategies that teachers have access to that they maybe haven't just coherently thought how to manage, which it's going to require a little bit more effort. And it's not something that I think that we've necessarily done really well, but I think it's something that we can force our attention to move toward, because we've spent so much of our time, I think, thinking about some of these formalized assessment events that we can spend most of our time thinking about the more informal assessment strategies. So I'll pause there. I'm sure Eric has something to add as well.
Yeah, what I would share is that, yes, we are looking at assessments, and we do have a new curriculum that we're utilizing in our grades K through 6. And so one of the things that did provide for us was the ability to have assessments that are aligned to the eligible content for the state. It also provides us an opportunity to work with, if you will, all populations of students that are within that grade band. So for example, English language learners, we're able to utilize some of those tools and resources to support those students as well. So what we're planning on doing this summer is utilizing a group of teachers to really work through what are the tools that we want to use, how do you see this being best utilized in the actual school building, given the resources that we already have, taken into account what we're coming back into. So we're really trying to take, if you will, a step back, engage a larger audience of people who are actually going to be doing the work, and let them guide our efforts along the way. So while we have a system that does provide for assessments in K through 6, we're also still looking at what opportunities we may be able to leverage in terms of supporting teachers, while at the same time not utilizing too much time, if you will, for actually administering the assessment in and of itself.
Can you talk a little bit, Eric, just to pull on that a little bit more in terms of the actual administration? Like, how is that going to look like? Are students going to take the test right when they get back to school? Should they do it before they come back to school? Is it going to be paper and pencil? Is it online? Like, give us a real sense of how those logistics might look like.
Sure. So we were fortunate in that we are now able to provide one-to-one technology for all of our students next year. So we're still in discussions around when is the assessment actually taken, or when will it be taken. We're thinking that, or the diagnostic, we're thinking that would definitely happen in the school building, not at the home, for various reasons, but that's the thinking. And then we're also talking about, well, what do we do with the data once we have it? Again, I'm really pushing the social and emotional learning piece, because I think we're going to definitely have to deal with that. But then we need to make sure that we have resources in place to support the data that comes out of the assessment. How are we going to support the students? How are we going to keep them on the right track? Are there other things that those students might need when they're in the building? Again, I see the first 2 weeks being focused solely on the social and emotional learning side of the house. And really haven't gotten any pushback, if you will, from teachers around, yes, we think that's the best thing that we should be doing once we come back. And ironically enough, teachers are also saying that they may also need some support on the social and emotional learning side as well. So we're also looking at ways in which we can support them in August, when we provide our professional development sessions. So it will be happening once we get back into school. We will have a systemized, if you will, systemic process around the administration. What are we going to do with some of the data, and being able to make sure that we can support students as well as our staff?
Juan and Laura, I'd also sort of like to ask you guys, like, with all the uncertainty in terms of whether schools are going to reopen this fall. I mean, I like how Eric sort of spoke with some certainty there in terms of when they get back, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. But if schools, I mean, you can imagine the schools are not going to be able to open sort of in person this fall. Like, how should they approach sort of this question of how do you administer? Do you wait then until you can sort of have kids come back? Like, what's your thoughts?
I think one of the things that's really important to do is to initially triage what needs exist. And I know there was a couple notes that came through the chat, but I think about the things that are really required to do. And there has to be a way of, and one of the things many states that we've been working with at the center that have been talking about is trying to invest in proactive planning in case there are things like rolling closures, or if there are transitions to partly remote learning or blended learning models. And so that's already on the minds of a lot of states to try to support that in a systematic way. I don't think we're going to be ready in the fall, but I think if you think about purely from an equity standpoint, and the fact that there are a lot of kids that lost access to educational opportunities and services. You think about the very specific case of English language learners. You need to screen them in the fall when the school starts back up in order to obtain services. Same thing with ensuring that kids have access to establishing their IEPs, their individualized educational programs at the beginning of the school to make sure they're getting the kind of supports that they need from an instructional standpoint so that can then be followed through for the assessment. I think if there are ways to think about it from doing it at schools as centers where kids come in temporarily, if that needs to be then a high priority issue when schools are reopening, whether early, late, or on time. The question about content and what that looks like in terms of a delivery, I know that many states and districts are thinking about trying to collect maybe more informal data on a more frequent basis when kids are at home. It raises tremendous infrastructural equity issues because we've seen a lot of preliminary data that are kind of exacerbating some of the opportunity gaps. Kids that have access to this stuff, kids that don't, we're unknown how far back they're falling because we don't have data to support any interpretations. So I think it really is on us to think about how to try to use the brick and mortar school as a way to support students to at least on a rolling cycle come back in to get some access to services, and that may be a thing that we have to think about more carefully.
If you have, just for everyone who's tuned in, we're getting to that time where we'll have some opportunity for some Q&A. So you can visit the ellipsis in terms of looking at your screen and enter a question, and these three folks would be more than happy to take a stab at those and answering those. My next question, while that's happening, is sort of more directed. Laura, I'd love to get your thoughts on this. In terms of after we get some sort of data from these assessments, I mean, is the thought then that, painting with a really broad brush, that schools, teachers are then pulling out kids left and right and start working with them in small, I mean, like what do they do with this information that once they get it, Laura?
Well, ensuring that students have maximum exposure to high quality content, curriculum, and instructional practices should always be a goal. And I don't know that we have data to support that pulling kids out of classroom to provide them additional services on the whole really benefits students. So I do think it's about providing teachers, all educators, frankly, how to integrate what they learn from the assessment data into regular instruction. Whether that's through things like, additional high quality tutoring, or it's providing just additional hours of schooling for students. I think more, not less, of high quality is really the goal. But since you kind of pointed out the issue of what do we do with the data, one thing we should absolutely not do with data from diagnostic assessments is use it for evaluative purposes. This is really just for instructional and support purposes to make sure that students are getting what they need when they need it and not hold anyone accountable.
Makes a lot of sense. Sort of on a, in terms of the low stakes nature of this, it seems to me, at least when I sort of put on my hat as a former teacher, like if the learning loss is as dire as folks are projecting it to be, I could definitely see sort of this temptation, for lack of a better description, to say, okay, well, if we're not pulling, let's say, kids out, going back to, this is not what Eric was saying, but to Eric's initial idea of like grouping students, I could see schools saying, let's essentially track these students now. Let's put all sort of the really low ones together and do this, because it's just so much. And then we have to sort of like, Juan, I'm gonna take your word of triage, but use it sort of like in a different context here. But like, we're just gonna have to, do this concept we normally wouldn't do, and maybe we'll end up spending a few months like trying to catch kids up that were that are way behind. What's your thought on this, Eric? I'd love to sort of get your reaction, and then get Juan and Laura as well.
Yeah, I don't agree at all with putting students all together based upon some data that says these are the kids we have to catch up. I think we have a responsibility to teach students the content at their grade level. All students deserve that as a minimum. What I think we do is we scaffold the learning for students who we identify as having some gaps, or maybe they have not fully grasped some prior concepts. And so when they haven't, that's when you utilize small group instruction to really work with those students to really scaffold their learning appropriately. Sometimes you may also utilize adaptive technology to help. While the teacher's working with one small group, you may have another group of students working on some adaptive technology resource to help those students move along. So I think at a minimum, we have to make sure that we are providing the grade appropriate instruction for students based upon what the standard indicates. And then we have to begin to work on filling in that gap. There may be a need to bring in an instructional assistant to work with a small group of students while the teacher is still doing what the teacher is doing, because that's our responsibility, and that's my belief.
Juan, Laura, you want to add or have other thoughts on what Eric just shared there?
No, I wholeheartedly agree. And I think that one of the things that is something that we're working on, that we're hopefully going to be pushing out soon, but one of the through lines with it is to kind of elevate the perceived value of teachers' assessment of student knowledge in the informal setting. And I think that kind of really coincides with what Eric is talking about, that there is a need to allow people to have the flexibility, so long as they have access to high quality curriculum, high quality resources, and a kind of a team-based approach to think about how these things all fit together in an instruction delivery model that actually addresses kind of grade level content. Anything that's external to that is going to help kind of triangulate our awareness of progress towards grade level expectations. But really, those are kind of like exit markers on the highway. The teachers are the ones that are driving the actual interstate. They're navigating the traffic. And I think we need to be able to allow them the space and the resources to do so. You wouldn't send someone on a trip without a full tank of gas, a GPS system, and probably some snacks in the car. So you got to kind of think about it in a way where we can't ask them to just make that trip sight unseen. We have to give them all the resources necessary, but also then give them the space to make sure that they can make those decisions. And then all we do is just check in every once in a while with the right kinds of resources. And that might look like a formalized assessment, but picking that at the right time.
And to add to that, I think what we're all saying is that the goal really needs to be providing access to master grade level content as the right goal and framework for thinking, rather than catching students up who are behind, which has really been our way of talking about the educational system, which is deficit thinking and hasn't really served us very well. So just reorienting the goal to be all students are mastering grade level content, and what are the resources that teachers need to reach that goal is really the goal that we've got to be centering.
So I'm gonna throw a question that we have now from Catherine in the audience. She says, what do aligned diagnostics look like in high school if ACT, SAT are the high stakes assessments? And then as a follow-up to that, does the recent colleges waiving the ACT, SAT entrance requirements change anything when it comes to high school diagnostics, summative trends?
I'll toss out an initial response, and I think that the answer to that is in the premise of why a state would have opted for the SAT or ACT as their high stakes assessment of choice. And it's kind of in one of a few different camps. One of them might be that that was the route that they believed their legislature wanted them to go. It might have been as a function of they believed that that was the currency for motivation that they could use with 11th graders, because that's what was going to be applied for college entry. And another one might be to give students the opportunity to see whether they can demonstrate and be college career ready material, so to speak, that they wouldn't have otherwise known. So part of, if you start eliminating, or if you disconnect the expectation from those assessments being the gatekeeper to going to certain colleges and universities, if that's out of the way, then we have to probably question again whether the 11th grade motivation answer is one that can be addressed with ACT or SAT assessments. If we're making claims about students that are that have some kind of grade level content expectation in grade 11, and there's some misalignment between those standards, then maybe it's worth revisiting. So I think that right now there are questions about the alignment between any predictive assessment that points to ACT or SAT. And I would actually begin with, and that's what I mean by the aligned diagnostic question. I'm assuming that aligned diagnostics refer to things that are intended to predict how well you're doing on ACT or SAT in the future. And the real question is, why would you do that anyway? Because of the use of kind of valuable time to get access to the standards is probably getting eaten up by some of that predictive test time, taking time anyway. So I think that it's probably too soon to tell, and it's going to be a major question of whether there's going to be a perceived shift in the composition of students that are applying, or the number of kids that are maybe taking a gap year because of the extended closures, that we see the impact of SAT, ACT reductions this year in college and university, and what that means for high school testing for the future. There has to be high stakes assessment once in high school for various statutory requirements under ESEA, and the time to pivot away from one of those assessments is pretty high investment. So I can't imagine the states are going to be able to do that very quickly.
Let me, we're getting close to sort of time here, and I want to give you guys each a moment to sort of like, if you were to sort of give one piece of advice to folks who are listening, what would that be? But before we get to that, I see another question about summative assessments and sort of like what the future holds for that. I'm going to hold on that question because our next and final event next week is actually going to focus on summatives. So if you want to answer that question, please come back. But let me get one final question before sort of go around to everyone here. Is the question is something that Eric mentioned about, bringing an instructional assistant or something to help sort of support kids rather than tracking or whatnot. Given the sort of the severe financial shortfalls states are facing, right? Like there's not going to be lots of money floating around to get additional assistance or whatnot. So bring it to this question of diagnostics. Like, how much is this going to cost? Like, if districts want to do this, what's the price tag? I'll start with Eric and Juan, Laura, if you have other thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, I think the price tag varies, and it's primarily based upon, I would say, what route you want to take. In some districts, there are individuals who are within the curriculum and instruction unit or within the assessment department, and some districts have the ability to write their own assessments, which has been done in some districts, and so they have that ability. Where you don't, I would say to you that you try to get it coupled with a curriculum that you are purchasing to better support what you're doing within the actual classroom. I think the key here is to make sure that when you do have limited resources, which we do in our district, we have to make sure that we are acting or working smart instead of hard. So how do you take the resources that you have and support the students maybe who are most at need based upon when you get the information back from your diagnostic? Who really needs the additional support? How do you then utilize that resource in different places or in different ways? So it does require, I would say, administrators to be a little bit more creative and what it is that they are doing. So that's what I would say. I think it definitely depends upon what resources you have within your district. I think some can be done in-house. Sometimes you have to utilize the curriculum that you may have purchased, or the curriculum that's been provided. Some districts are part of a consortium. So maybe, there's a group effort to develop assessments, or it's done by the consortium, and then you share that information with various districts. So I think there are different ways in which you can address that one.
I'll weigh in from a broader perspective. Dale, the way that you framed that question, I think, points to the need for far greater investment in education in America, because the types of districts that Dr. B. Coates talked about are going to be your wealthier districts, and they're wealthier because they've got more property taxes that they can pull from to fund their schools. And so we have an education system in America that is greatly divided between the haves and have-nots. And we have an opportunity to address that, and I hope that we take that. So as Congress thinks about any additional stimulus funding, K to 12 education, and in fact, all education, pre-K, higher ed, it needs much more funding because student needs are just going to be greater. And we should do right by our students by adequately funding them in schools.
All right, so with the last 3 minutes we have here, and thanks for all the questions from the audience as well, I'd like to give each of you a minute to sort of like share sort of closing thoughts you have, advice you have for folks who are listening when it comes to this dilemma around diagnostic assessments. I'll have, why don't we have Juan, will give you the first minute, and then we'll, Laura, you'll get the second minute, and then Eric, we'll have you wrap it up.
Okay.
Thanks, Dale. No pressure, right? So I think the major takeaway that I always come from these conversations, they've been more frequent with everything with the pandemic recently, is that it's going to be really hard to find a silver bullet. So probably stop looking for one. And what likely is going to be the most important, if you're really thinking about wanting to identify a formalized assessment process or assessment tool that is going to meet your needs, is to first clearly understand what your needs are and articulate those in light of really kind of a vision of teaching and learning, thinking about how well an assessment in terms of its administration characteristics, flexibility, level of granularity and reporting, alignment to your curriculum more than your standards, the flexibility of being able to sequence it, how well do all of those characteristics align to your needs and to your kind of that vision and how you plan on having teachers use that information, and knowing exactly where the value of that assessment ends. So don't overextend its utility or its value beyond anything more than it really can give you. And so if it's actually not filling in gaps of knowledge from an instructional standpoint, then maybe it doesn't need to be the driver of anything. Maybe it's just the thing that happens at the end to confirm that certain things have happened over the course of the first 3 weeks, 9 weeks, trimester, or semester.
Laura?
Yeah, I would say you want to assess all students in the beginning from the academic standpoint, physical and emotional well-being, and the engagement standpoint. And based on that data, identify those students who express greater need and dig a little bit deeper. I think if districts and schools can better triage their needs, they're going to be better positioned to be able to allocate their resources where those needs are greatest. So starting big and then funneling down, I think is going to be a strategic approach.
Eric?
One of the things that I'll say is in the situation that we're in within the pandemic, I would say that the good thing is that no one has charted this course before. The bad thing is that no one has charted this course before. But one of the things I will say is, as a district superintendent, understand what is your end goal, establish the goal, make sure that it's clear, and then develop or devise a diagnostic tool that can be used to help you achieve your goal. But while you are doing that, make sure that you're supporting the students on the front end upon their return to your school district, because I firmly believe that it will pay much, much larger dividends long term if you address some of the social and emotional challenges and then continue to support them throughout the school year.
Thank you, Eric. I can't think of a sort of a better note to sort of wrap on. I want to thank all three of our panelists for joining us, Eric, Juan, and Laura. But this is not the end. We have an event coming up next week. I think we were sort of hinting a little bit about this conversation during our talk today. But our next, the third event is called Summit of Spring. For those of you who are following this issue closely, you may have heard last week in Georgia, they signaled their intent to apply for a federal waiver from ESSA requirement to the question that someone had asked earlier. And so what does this mean in terms of, Laura talked about, we're not having accountability or low stakes in terms of the diagnostic, but what in terms of the spring test in 2021, what does this portend for accountability systems going forward? So we have a great group of folks that are going to be speaking. We have former Delaware Governor Jack Markell is going to be on the panel. We have Lynn Olson from Future Ed, who's going to be joining us, and also Denise Forte from EdTrust. So please stay tuned and join us on Tuesday, June 30th for our third and final event. With all of that, have a great rest of the day. And again, thanks to all of you for joining us, and thanks again to our panelists.